Hey, everybody. Thank you again for joining us and so all your support of my live streams. It's my pleasure to introduce SCOTUS lawyer Jason Harrow. He is the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Equal Citizens Organization. And among other things, wrote a path-breaking and I would say, in a sense, tone setting, considering our conversation, piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and also arguments before the Supreme Court on a couple of cases. And in his role as General Counsel and Executive Director for Equal Citizens. Hey, Jason, first of all, tell my viewers what Equal Citizens is all about, first of all, and welcome.
Well, it's great to be here tonight, Zennie. Thanks for having me, and great to see everybody virtually. We do democracy reform cases, so we're a nonpartisan organization. As many people know, we have a system that is unequal in many ways. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, your vote and your voice gets weighted differently based on where you live, how much money you have, whether it's, you are sort of more familiar with the voting process or not. And so we advocate. We were founded by a Harvard law professor named Larry Lessig. And Larry has long dedicated his career to this idea that the first issue that we should all be attentive to, if we want to have a functional politics, a politics that provides solutions for average citizens and every citizen, is that we need to make every vote equal, every voice equal. The rich, the poor, the middle class, the white, black, Latinx, etc. And that's what the organization is dedicated to. So it's nonpartisan.
Hey, talk about the case that you argued before the Supreme Court earlier this year and what it was about and essentially how it set up what we're dealing with now.
Yeah. So, the Supreme Court has not really comprehensively talked about the role of the Electoral College and how we have this thing called the presidential election, which, Zennie, as we can talk about, is really not one presidential election. It's really 51 presidential elections, or more specifically, 51 elections for presidential elector, because each state holds its own election for members of the Electoral College. And only then those folks vote and send their votes to the Congress, which then counts it. So the Supreme Court has not sort of worked out these things in quite a while. And we, in the interest of settling an open question, brought a case that was argued this May by phone, one of the first cases argued by phone in U.S. Supreme Court history, about the role of presidential electors, who they were, and whether states could require them to vote for the winner of the popular vote in the state. Because folks may know, and Zennie, you may know, there have been occasional episodes in history where presidential electors have voted for people who did not win the state, maybe third-party candidates, something like that. So that was the question on the table. We had an argument by phone, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court decided in a landmark decision that I think is having a lot of good resonance for what's happening now with Donald Trump's election challenges, that states do have the power to control the vote of presidential electors. And the principle is that perhaps the court said one day, many, many hundred years ago, 200 some odd years ago, the founding framers of the Constitution thought that presidential elections would be very different. There wouldn't even be a popular vote, right? That these people who are just members of the Electoral College would sort of get up, meet in their states sometime in November, December, and pick the best person, regardless of party, regardless of anything, to be the president. Well, that hasn't happened. And so given that hasn't happened, what the Supreme Court says, and here I'm quoting the last 4 words of the Supreme Court's decision, "We the people rule." And what "we the people rule" means is that the electors are really just anonymous, Zennie. They're really just machinery. And so the electors are supposed to give meaning to the will of the people. And that's, I think, really having resonance today, because what Donald Trump is asking is fundamentally counter to that decision that was made only months ago, right? What he's trying to say is the electors don't have to have a necessary connection with the people. They can just be what the state legislature thinks, or they can just be what Donald Trump, thinks. I think I won. Don't ask me why, don't ask me how, but I think I won. So maybe the elector should vote for me. Well, that's, according to the case I argued, Zennie, that's just not how the Constitution works.
What do you think about the idea that this is all over Twitter, that essentially Trump got had by his own appointees? And I'm 58 years old, and one thing that I consistently find myself tickled pink over is how the media and we are led to think that someone, be it Chief Justice Roberts or Amy Coney Barrett, is going to hold a liberal or conservative line. And I do have to admit that I was personally affected by the 2000 vote, if you remember that. So there is that. But it seems more often than not, they really do behave like lawyers or people who respect the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, so the only data point that we have about what the U.S. Supreme Court, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, the three Trump appointees on the Supreme Court, think of this election and what happened is this decision from today, which was a one-line, no reasoning order. And that was totally expected, Zennie, because the case that the Supreme Court was asked to do something about was so extraordinary and really just outrageous that I agree with you. You know, if you're anywhere in the vicinity of law, if you're trying to be anything close to fair, calling balls and strikes, you would reject this extraordinary attempt, not only to count a few ballots that Donald Trump might have identified, but literally throw out the results of millions of people voting with no evidence, and really the thinnest, most absurd legal argument possible. And, you know, those three justices, like the other six justices, just said no, right? I mean, and there's nothing more they did say and nothing more they had to say about that. So, Zennie, what that means in terms of whether, as you said, these Trump appointees are going to be calling balls and strikes and thinking about law rather than politics, if it were really close, who knows, right? If it were Bush, you brought up Florida 2000, folks might remember that turned on 537 votes in Florida. And whoever won one state, Florida, won the election. Well, when it comes to that small, there's probably good arguments on both sides. And, you know, there were 5 Republican appointed justices that voted for George W. Bush, right? In 2000, that was enough. Yeah. Here, it's not nearly so close. So without a colorable, as lawyers say, colorable argument, reasonable argument, I do think you're right that Amy Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch are not just in the pocket of President Trump.
Hey, in your article, you talked about Samuel Miles. Talk about Samuel Miles and Samuel Miles' importance in all this, if you would.
I did, yeah. Thanks for bringing up Samuel Miles. He's one of my favorite historical figures. Samuel Miles is, to this day, the only member of the Electoral College that was expected to vote for the candidate of one major party and ended up voting for the candidate of the other major party. That hasn't happened since 1796. So these faithless electors people talk about, it hasn't happened since 1796 that someone switched from Biden to Trump or did what, right? They may have, like in 2016, people switched from Clinton to someone else like Kasich or Colin Powell or even Bernie Sanders, right? But they didn't. That was more of a protest and more of a movement to deny Trump the presidency, not because they had some sort of switch. Samuel Miles is the only person to have a switch. But in a way, Zennie, he actually illustrates why the Electoral College might in some ways have some little purpose, and how what happened in 1796 was totally different than what happened today. So this was 1796 Pennsylvania. And the George Washington decided he was not going to run for a third term for president. George Washington ran above political party. Well, below him, following him, there were emerging political parties, right? Folks who have seen the musical Hamilton or know American history sort of know that on the one hand, there were the Federalists, right? They wanted a stronger federal government. They were represented by Hamilton in the musical Hamilton. They were represented by John Adams in the election of 1796. And then there was what historians call they didn't have official names. I mean, they were startup companies at the time, right? But the Jeffersonian Party, called the Democratic Republicans a little later. It's not clear it was called the Democratic Republicans at the time, but let's call them the Jeffersonians. And they were more of the emerging states' rights party, more of the more rural voters, and the Federalists were more of the urban voters and the merchant class at the time. So this is the emerging battle lines of the nation. And in 1796, you used to vote, Zennie, for elector directly. You folks who went to the polls in Pennsylvania didn't vote for Adams or Jefferson. They voted for Samuel Miles or Zennie Abraham or Jason Harrow, and they knew that Zennie Abraham would support one candidate or the other. Well, in 1796, there was a bizarre. It took a while to count the votes. Let's put it that way. And what happened, because it took so long to count the votes, was it was super close. And it turned out that of just a few votes separated the last electors of Jefferson from the first electors of Adams, right? And so what ultimately happened was, and I'm just going to make sure that I have my facts exactly right here, but Samuel Miles was finished basically in last place, and of the 15 possible electors. And what happened is that he was everybody knew that he would support John Adams. He was supposed to support John Adams. Okay. But really all the electors were supposed to vote for Jefferson. And it's a little complicated, but so let me sum it. And this answer is getting a little long. And I said, I just want to check.
This yeah. My viewers love this.
Okay. So he really was Samuel Adams and Samuel Miles, an Adams person. He was an Adams voter. And the governor ended up appointing him when the votes were still coming in. And the governor appointed 13 electors that the world knew would support Jefferson. And Samuel Miles was one of 2 that would support Adams. Well, when all the returns came in a couple days later, it turned out, Samuel Miles had lost by a couple of votes, not won by a couple of votes. So that should have meant that 15 Jefferson electors should have won and 0 Adams electors. So what did Samuel do when it came time to vote? He voted for Jefferson instead of Adams. And he didn't write a long reasoning. He wasn't a judge or anything. But the prevailing view is that he recognized that the people really didn't vote for him. The people really voted for Jefferson. And but for this weird counting error, he wouldn't have been there. So it wasn't about him. He said it was about the voters. And those voters chose Jefferson. Now, think about that in the context of today. The exact opposite thing is happening. Joe Biden has won an election by 7 million votes nationally. He's won it by tens of thousands of votes in the key swing states. And what Donald Trump is now saying to the presidential electors is be the anti-Samuel Miles, right? You've been appointed in Pennsylvania, Joe Biden electors, because Biden won Pennsylvania by 80,000 votes. But, says Donald Trump, you should go against the people and vote for Trump instead of Biden. That doesn't work, right? That's never happened in U.S. history. It didn't even happen in 1796. And it's totally inconsistent with the literally unbroken precedent.
What makes him think let me ask this an entirely other way. Have you ever thought, in your history and mine, that we would have a president, let alone a candidate, who would seek, it would seem, at every turn to behave in a way that's ungentlemanly? What I mean by that is, it seems that our laws and customs are made for ladies and gentlemen, if you will, and we never fathomed what would happen if someone didn't play by the rules. For the first time, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, we have a person who does not playing by the rules. Should we then readjust our laws to say, hey, look, you have to be I don't know if it's a compact or something, but a goodness rule or a moral compass or morals clause. Are we missing something?
It's a great point, but I think that what the problem is that written constitutions and written rules, Zennie, are only as good as the people implementing them. And so, you can set up as many rules as you want on paper. If people want to cheat, right, and want to lie, it's very, very hard to protect against that. And so your point is a great one, which is the system is set up to some extent, not to every extent. The whole concept of checks and balances is that people would be sort of putting their own self-interest in many ways above the nation's interest, right? And so we'd have this war and people would have to strike compromises, and there it is. Now, but as every grade schooler knows, and I think your analogy to being a lady and a gentleman is a good one. And in some ways, I view it as a child versus an adult, because every child learns quickly that no one likes the person who takes their ball and goes home. No one likes the person who, recognizes that there's really sort of the referee can only do so much on the basketball court or whatever. If you're playing pickup and if you're just going to foul every time, it's just going to be no fun. But what can we do? We just have to say you got to play the right way, right? And I think most people learn that as kids. And then you become an adult and you sort of realize, oh shoot, we've been making all of this up. All of this is made up, right? There's no sort of NFL referee in life who can blow the whistle and everyone will abide by those rules. We have to be the ones that abide by our own rules. And we have to, as much as possible, operate in good faith with one another. And when we don't operate in good faith, we have to, you're right, figure out fallbacks. And the question, Zennie, is what happens when you have someone at the very, very top who does not follow that rule, who acts like a child, who does not act like a gentleman, who takes his ball and goes home? I think, as I've thought about it, I think you're right. We could do a little bit of a better job with some safeguards. We could, for instance, have a somewhat more professional organization for like counting votes rather than leaving it to politicians. Other countries, for instance, don't really leave it up to the politicians to count the votes. They have like independent boards. But at the same time, independent board, they're still people. They're still humans. They could still, who oversees the board, who funds the board. It's
What do you think about the argument that the Texas Attorney General is making? He's got 4 cases. On Twitter, someone had surmised that he's not really playing with a full case deck. In other words, a good argument. This person thinks that the Texas Attorney General, who's fighting his own FBI investigation, may just be playing for a pardon. What are your thoughts about what the Texas Attorney General is attempting to do in this regard? Hey, Jason, do this. I'm having trouble hearing you on this end. go out and come back in and see if that clears it up. There's some sort of it happens from time to time. Some sort of data latency.
How about now?
Perfect. Yeah, whatever you just did. That
I think somehow my mic was muted at the end of that.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. So as anyway, you were yeah. Let's pick up the whole matter about the Texas Attorney General from there. And this is a person who has not one but four cases representing four different states, as I understand it.
I think it's technically one case against four states. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, I think that is not a legal case, really. I mean, it technically is, but it's a press release that is masquerading as a legal case, right? It's and I don't say that lightly. People have a right to their day in court, but there's a couple of clear facts that reveal that. The first is that the normal lawyers in the Texas Department of Justice who would sign Supreme Court filings, a man named Kyle Hawkins, who is the state solicitor general, that is the chief appellate lawyer of the state of Texas. He did not sign it, and none of his deputies did. And that usually only happens when government lawyers think not only is a case wrong, but that there is not even any viable argument whatsoever, and it would actually violate their oath to be a lawyer, right? Their oath to only bring non-frivolous cases. That this person concluded that in good faith, he couldn't even sign the brief, right? That's how bad the legal arguments was. Because you're not allowed under the professional rules of conduct, Zennie, to bring a case only for purposes of delay or harassment. You have to have a good faith belief that you can actually win, and that there's actually law and facts supporting your case, or you can be disbarred. So we know that the real lawyers, not the politicians, the lawyers in the office of the Texas Attorney General thought this case was complete BS. So that's the first reason. The second reason is the timing. Yeah.
The question. Your comment seems to imply that the Texas Attorney General could be disbarred.
Well, it's very unlikely, right? The prospect that this would happen is unlikely, but folks can make a complaint to the Texas Bar Association that this filing violates the rules of professional conduct. And the Texas Attorney General could be sanctioned for if after investigation, the Texas Bar concludes that there was not a good faith legal argument and that the suit was brought only for purposes of delay and harassment. Now, that's wildly unlikely to happen in a case like this. But I will say I've written and folks have made complaints about about lawyers in some of these other cases who have affirmatively sort of lied to a court. You can't lie to a court. Lawyers have this reputation for lying, that they're untruthful. It's a little bit ironic in some ways, Zennie, because it's actually against their professional obligations, right? If they lie to a court, you can lose your law license for that. So again, I'm not saying that Ken Paxton, who's the Attorney General of Texas, has lied. I'm not saying he will be disbarred, but I am saying that lawyers take that obligation seriously. And when lawyers for the government don't sign briefs that their bosses do, it means something.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, what it means is that there's not a great argument here for this case. The second reason is the timing. These cases, which are called original cases, because they're filed directly in the U.S. Supreme Court under what's called the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction, which is why they're called original cases, they take a while. And it would make no sense, none whatsoever, for Texas to file today or after midnight or so, 6 days before the Electoral College is scheduled to meet. Why'd they wait? You know, Trump has been making these claims for over a month now. And it's just, it's a total political stunt. You ended the question by asking, is it possible Ken Paxton is out for a pardon? I guess it's always possible that he's out for the good favor of the president. That is certainly not a valid reason if you're a lawyer to bring your case. I will say it is a federal investigation. So President Donald Trump does, a pardon would take effect. Of course, the U.S. president can pardon for federal offenses, but not state offenses. So Ken Paxton might still be on the hook for violations of Texas state law. But it is possible that that's behind it. You would hope not. That would be really disastrous. You shouldn't buy your way to a pardon. You shouldn't get political favors. You shouldn't be able to bribe your way to a pardon. But the president has broad pardon power, and maybe he'll pardon Ken. I don't know.
When will all this be over?
Well, January 20th at 12:01 p.m. is the date certain. That's the date the Constitution says the next term of the president will begin. And Joe Biden is essentially certain to be sworn in then. We could go back in time and say that it should be over sooner. It certainly should be over on January 6th when the U.S. Congress meets in a joint session to count the votes of the Electoral College. It really should be over, Zennie, on December 14th. December 14th, next week, is the date when all of the members of the Electoral College will meet around the country. Everybody meets in their state capital, the electors of each state. They don't get together in Washington. And they will vote on December 14th. It really, you could consider it over today now, Zennie, as we speak, because today is what's called the safe harbor deadline. That is the date by which federal law says that the electors appointed on that day are really, absent extraordinary circumstances, supposed to be counted by Congress, right? So if Georgia says that Biden won by 10,000 votes by today, and there's no active challenge, right? And there's no there's no appointment of Trump electors or something or competing claim, then Congress is supposed to count the Biden electors because they were appointed by today and because they're going to go meet and vote on December 14th. So those are all the times you could say it's over, Zennie. I mean, there's a guy in the Oval Office who will probably never, to his dying breath, admit that it was over. So, what does that mean? Maybe on the one hand, it's never over because Trump will leave in 12:01 and say it was still stolen, and we don't know what's going to happen. That's never really happened in U.S. history. On the other hand, it's basic. People shouldn't be losing sleep over this right now. It's basically over now. Donald Trump has no path to victory.
Well, hey, so as we close, I'd like to have you back again to this is fantastic. But what do we make? How much damage has this done to our system?
TBD, Zennie, TBD. It's a great question. It's a great question to end on. And what I mean is that we don't know, right? It's easy to understand financial damage, right? We know the financial damage of the Great Recession and financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We know the vast toll in lives and money of something like the Iraq War. We know that. What we don't know is what it means for a president to make up lies hundreds of times, dozens of times over the course of a day, basically give up governing. No one has really talked about it. He appears to not be doing any governing right now. Right? He has no events on his schedule.
Not at all. None.
Yeah, he has no events on his schedule. He doesn't really tweet about anything policy related. He is just apparently focused on watching weird right-wing news sources and tweeting about how the election's been stolen from him.
It's cool to think of it. The White House press list stuff. I get more from the Biden people now.
Right.
It's interesting because I'm on the White House.
It's not, it's extraordinary. Right. And and he's just spouting these conspiracy theories. And I will say it's a little bit unclear what both the impact of it and whether people are really listening to it or taking it seriously. Right. There's interesting research about so you could poll people and you could ask, do you believe the election was stolen? And I think the number has been thrown around to 77% or 70%. Some 7 or 8 out of 10 people who support the president think the election was stolen, or that's what they say. But what does that mean, right? We don't know. Does it mean they're going to believe that forever? Does it mean they'll change their mind when they see Joe Biden inaugurated? And hopefully next year, other Republicans will say that was weird, right? Or does it mean that what they're saying is it's a little like being a sports fan. You know, another analogy, I like sports analogies with politics. And you know, a thing I like to think about is like, what would you get if you ask Patriots fans, you know, about Deflategate or about their cheating scandals or about things like that? They'd probably say, of course, I don't think Belichick did it, or, you know, or Brady did it. Does it mean they really? No, it means they kind of support the team. And maybe they didn't, maybe they did, but that's just what you say when you're a Patriots fan, right? And maybe the same thing is happening here, which is maybe people are just saying fraud because the president's saying fraud and I'm on Team Trump. And if that, you know, and if that's the case, then this might just be like all of the other things the president has done, which is just, you know, it's another thing he's throwing out there. It's another thing to grab headlines. It's another thing to sort of rile his people up. Maybe that's it. And maybe we go into more normal, or maybe, Zennie, this is the new normal. And that's troubling. But that's why I started by saying the answer is to be determined, because there's so much, this is so new and there's so much unknown.
Hey, gonna have you back soon. Jason Harrow, excellent. Hey, stick around in the backstage. Folks, we'll be back later in the week with more from Zennie 62. It's an exciting time, albeit somewhat scary. Hey, Jason, stick around in the backstage. Thanks again. Thanks a lot.
That was fun.
Okay, cool.